to go back a little bit to the Mississippi Miracle and how this has been kind of front and center in politics, and we're so great. We've done these great things in education, and all these statistics. We're now number 4 in having an African American reading age in 4th grade, I believe is what the number was, or so it was somewhere way higher up than we were before. But how are they able to tell us these things if it's not accurate?
I get that if you're a long-serving politician, you're going to want to tell people things are going well. I get that, but it doesn't make it right. It doesn't mean it's truthful. It doesn't mean it's honest. The truth is that in 2013, there was a change in the law that insisted that people in Mississippi were taught using so-called phonics. That's basically teaching kids to read and write properly. Mm-hmm. And after that law came in 2013, we saw some improvement in reading standards. Not a huge leap forward, but we saw some progress between 2013 and 2019. There's not been any improvement in reading standards since then. But when they talk about the Mississippi Miracle, they're talking about a change in the law that happened a decade ago and some marginal improvement that followed. What then happened is that COVID struck. And, or I should say, the lockdown struck. Uh-huh. I think the lockdowns were the problem, not the COVID. The politicians responding to COVID was the problem rather than the virus. They imposed these lockdowns, and that hammered the education system in states right across America. And weirdly, Mississippi was less badly impacted by the lockdown in terms of education than other states. So Mississippi didn't really change in terms of reading standards, but other states did a lot worse. And that made us then look like we were moving up the tables, which we were, mm-hmm. because not because we were getting better, but because other states were getting worse faster. And so what the Republican Party establishment politicians are trying to do is to fool you into thinking that somehow we've seen a sustained improvement in reading standards because of them. We saw a partial increase as a result of a law nearly a decade ago, and then COVID meant other states performed far worse than we did. That made us look good. The idea that this means that all is fine and dandy is nonsense, and I'll give you a couple of examples as to why it's nonsense. I said earlier, 1 in 4 kids in Mississippi is absent, chronically absent from school. You cannot possibly think that you're delivering good standards in education or that graduation rates have improved if 1 in 4 kids are not turning up regularly to school. It's also the case that although politicians claim things are getting better in Mississippi, here's my favorite statistic. Amongst 4th graders, only 4 out of 10 achieve basic standards of reading. I'm not talking about proficiency, I'm talking about the basic standard. How many politicians do you know who think there's been a Mississippi Miracle would be willing to send their children to a school in Mississippi where 4 out of 10 kids couldn't do basic reading?
Right.
Now, there's a double standard applied here. If they think things are so good, then why aren't they sending kids to schools with those standards? It's one rule for me and one rule for thee. And I think Corey DeAngelis and others are going to start calling time on this. They call time on it in Texas. You cannot call yourself a conservative if you're not in favor of school choice in Texas anymore. You cannot claim to be a conservative in Mississippi if you are not willing to give people the sorts of freedoms and control over their kids' education that they now have in states around us. It's going to be painful for some Republican politicians to
I think
to come
I
to terms
saw
with this.
Corey going back and forth with one of our senators.
Well, I know one senator here, and he was criticizing the idea that you should take, as he saw it, public dollars out of public schools and spend them in private schools. Well, they're not public dollars. They're taxpayer dollars.
Right.
They're family dollars. If you're one of the many Mississippians who homeschools, what are they doing with your money? Why can't they let you use that on books and what have you? It's not it was Senator Blunt. It's not Senator Blunt's money. It's the taxpayers' money. And then, of course, it came to my attention that this senator sent his kids to private school. I'm sorry, but there's a rude word that starts with an H called hypocrisy. If you are going to stand for office and say you're against school choice, you better be certain that you do not send your kids to private school. If you are going to lecture people in Mississippi about the Mississippi Miracle, you better be jolly certain that you're willing to send your kids to schools that have the same mediocre outcomes as the state averages. You can't get away with any more of this nonsense anymore.
Why is it, or why do you think it is that we don't see more charter schools around in Mississippi?
It's deliberate. 10 years ago, a law was passed to allow charter schools, and that was a concession to pressure by think tanks like ours. But they deliberately gamed the system. They created an organization called the Mississippi Charter Authorizer Board, which would be more accurately described as the Mississippi Charter Non-Authorizer Board.
Who appoints that board?
The governor, the lieutenant governor, and it's set up to say no. 8 out of 10 applications by mums and dads to set up new charter schools have been rejected by that organization. And it's deliberate. It's intentional. They don't want more charter schools. For a start, they've said you can only set up a charter school in an F or D rated district. I think that's really, really unfair. Surely it should be for families to decide if there's a demand for charter schools. If there's no demand for charter school in a certain district, well, we'll figure that out. We don't need these restrictions. So the whole system has been set up so that politicians can say, look, I'm in favor of school choice, when they need to, in the hope that it won't bar them from appearing on Fox News, but they're not actually delivering any meaningful school choice because they're against it. After 10 years of legislation to allow charter schools, guess how many we have in the entire state of Mississippi? 10. 10 charter schools in the entire state. Less than 0.5% of all the schools in Mississippi are charter schools. There are more charter schools in a single suburb of New Orleans than in the whole of Mississippi. It's pathetic. It's tragic. Imagine a world in which the $7,000 to $9,000 every year that the state government has for your child's education, you could control rather than them. Imagine if you gave every mum and dad in Mississippi control over that money. Imagine if you created a bank account, call it an education support account, an ESA, and you paid that taxpayer money, that government money, into that account for your child, and you, the parent, could then decide where that money went. You don't need to imagine it. They do this now in Arkansas. They do this now in Alabama. They just passed the legislation a few weeks ago to do this in Louisiana. In other words, Mississippi is now surrounded on 3 sides by states in which every family gets between $7,000 and $9,000 a year for their kids' education.
And it's working.
And it's working. And it's wildly popular. And it helps people who need help the most. It helps people who don't have a voice, people who are forced to put up with the public education system and take what they're given and not complain. Suddenly, they're given choices. They're able to say, no, I don't want my child to go to that school. I want them to go to this school. Or I don't want them to study what the people in this school want. I want them maybe spend a bit of the budget on teaching them something else. Suddenly, they have the ability to make choices that today only rich people can make. It's transforming education. It's improving standards. And, here in Mississippi, there's often all this glib talk by politicians about the Mississippi Miracle. Let me tell you, there's no Mississippi Miracle. There hasn't been a Mississippi Miracle. 1 in 4 children in Mississippi's public education system are chronically absent. There's nothing to brag about in a system where 1 in 4 people don't turn up. The Mississippi Miracle is a myth. What would change education in Mississippi is giving parents control of their tax dollars. They've done it in 3 of the 4 states around us. They're about to do it in Tennessee next year. Why does Mississippi always need to be last for these things? We can do it here. Now, I think if you had school choice, you would transform not just the standards, you would transform the values in the education system. Because if every mum and dad had the power to say, I'm taking my child out of this school because you're teaching woke things, you're teaching an ideology, that you're teaching values that conflict with mine, I think that would act as the ultimate check on woke agendas in schools. You're never going to drive woke ideology out of schools until you give mum and dad the power to say, I'm taking my child and their funds to another school.
And who wants better for their children other than their parents? Obviously, they want the best for their children no matter what. you've had Corey DeAngelis here, who
Yep.
just wrote a book called The Parent Revolution. I think every parent should read. And then you also had
Corey DeAngelis is one of my heroes.
amazing,
He really is.
absolutely amazing, incredible human being. And you also had Betsy DeVos here.
Yep.
And it's funny because her chief of staff, Nate, he just did a training with us, with Moms for Liberty members. But I talked to him on the phone after Betsy spoke at your luncheon here in Mississippi, and he said, why is Mississippi so far behind in the times? Why can't we get you to catch up?
Mm-hmm.
And that just struck a chord with me. I know we had a lot of legislators there that day for that luncheon.
Mm-hmm.
Are you seeing that we may get this done sooner than later?
We've got an ally in this, and the ally is the new speaker, Jason White. Jason White is committed to school choice. Jason White understands the importance of public education. He's a big believer in public education. He's used public education. He also understands private. He's also used private. He understands the need for both, and he thinks quite rightly that Mississippi needs to stop burying its head in the sand and make these changes. Mississippi exports a lot of its brightest and the best. They leave this state, they move to other states. Mississippi is often 50th out of 50. If we want to change things, we've got to improve the education system, and he completely gets that. The problem is that there's a certain kind of politician in Mississippi who thinks that they can call themselves conservative just because they happen to hunt and just because they've got the right stickers on the bumper of their truck.
Yeah.
And this is holding our state back. It's do-nothing conservatism. And do-nothing conservatism is the root cause of this state's problem. It's a political cartel. It means that people vote conservative but never actually get things like school choice. And that has to change. So we've got some allies here. We need to support them. We need to be prepared to ruffle feathers, though. We need to be able to say, look, I'm done with the good old boys.
Right.
I'm done with politicians who are scared to pick fights with the vested interests in the teaching unions. I'm done with politicians pretending that woke ideology is not being trained. How can it be that in a Republican-controlled state we can have left-wing ideologues control the teacher training in our state? This has to change. So we can win this, but I'm afraid we're going to have to pick some fights and ruffle some feathers. But the good news is we have a speaker who's on our side. And we began to move towards this in the last legislature. I mean, to be brutally honest, they didn't actually do much in the state legislature last session. But the one thing they did do was school funding reform, so that at least every child gets a dedicated, personalized budget. Now, that doesn't mean that they can take the money with them, but it's a step towards that.